There is a fundamental rule in the galaxy that every species learns, eventually. You can bomb our outposts, you can blockade our trade routes, and we will sit down to negotiate. But if you touch a human child, negotiation ends. 10 minutes. That's all it took for an empire to fall. The air on the frontier colony of New Roanoke was always thick with red dust and the low hum of atmospheric processors. It was a quiet mining settlement, officially designated as a civilian agricultural and extraction hub. It was the last place in the Orion Spur that anyone expected to be the flashpoint for the most terrifying display of military precision in galactic history. On the morning of the 12th of October, 2344, Sarah Bennett was walking her 7-year-old son, Liam, to the colony's primary learning center. Liam was swinging a heavily battered toy spaceship, humming a tune that had been popular on Earth half a century ago. The sky above them was a bruised purple, typical for the morning cycle on New Roanoke. Then the sky cracked open. There was no warning klaxon, no radar blip picked up by the colony's rudimentary defense grid. The invading vessels didn't drop out of standard slip space. They brutally forced their way into the atmosphere, utilizing displacement drives that shattered the sound barrier and blew out the windows of every habitat module within a 10-mile radius. They were the Crimson Pact, a highly aggressive, deeply militaristic coalition led by Warlord Richter. Richter was a brutal tactician who had spent the last decade absorbing weaker planetary systems, subjugating their populations, and daring the Interstellar Council to intervene. For years, the Council, a sluggish, bureaucratic entity headquartered on Geneva Prime, had done nothing but issue strongly worded condemnations. Humanity, a relatively new addition to the galactic stage, was perceived by Richter as soft. They were diplomats, traitors, and engineers. They were, in his eyes, prey. Richter wanted to make a statement. He didn't just want to take New Roanoke. He wanted to humiliate humanity in front of the entire galaxy. As the landing craft slammed into the colony's central plaza, massive, heavily armored infantry poured out. They were giants, clad in dark, interlocking kinetic armor, wielding weapons that fired localized plasma bursts. The colonists were immediately herded into the center of the plaza, thousands of light years away, on Geneva Prime. The Interstellar Council was in emergency session. Arthur Pendleton, the High Minister of the Council, watched in horror as the central holovision in the Grand Chamber flickered to life. Richter had hijacked the deep space communication buoys. He was broadcasting the raid live to every civilized world in the quadrant. In the council chamber, seated calmly among panicking alien delegates and sweating politicians, was Ambassador Thomas Arrington. Arrington was a former naval intelligence officer, a man whose face seemed permanently etched in stone. He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply watched the holographic feed with cold, unblinking eyes. On the screen, the towering figure of Warlord Richter's field commander stepped forward. The plaza of New Roanoke was eerily silent, save for the crying of terrified citizens. The commander began to speak, his voice translated through the broadcast in a booming, metallic echo. He spoke of human weakness, of the inevitable right of conquest, and of the Council's impotence. To emphasize his point, the commander marched into the crowd of huddled colonists. He stopped in front of Sarah Bennett. Liam, terrified but fiercely protective in the way only a 7-year-old boy can be, stepped in front of his mother. He raised his plastic toy spaceship, a pathetic shield against a towering monstrosity of armor and malice. The field commander laughed a harsh, static sound. Without a second thought, he raised his massive gauntlet and backhanded the child. The sickening crack echoed through the plaza and across the live feed, broadcasting to trillions of viewers. Liam was thrown backward, landing limply in the red dust. Sarah screamed, throwing herself over her son's motionless body. In the council chamber on Geneva Prime, a collective gasp ripped through the room. Minister Pendleton slammed his gavel down, screaming for order, his face pale with shock. "Ambassador Arrington," Pendleton cried out, "we must surrender the colony. We must beg for terms before they slaughter everyone." Thomas Arrington slowly stood up from his desk. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit. He looked at the giant holographic projection of Warlord Richter, who was watching the broadcast from his dreadnought, the Oblivion, orbiting just outside the new Roanoke system. Arrington raised his wrist, glancing at his silver analog watch. "Minister Pendleton," Arrington said, his voice cutting through the panic of the room like a scalpel. "The time for terms ended precisely 4 seconds ago. I suggest you hold your breath." It was 0800 hours, standard galactic time. The clock had started. What Warlord Richter and his Crimson Pact failed to understand was a heavily classified piece of human military doctrine known as the Artemis Contingency. Humanity had not survived its own violent history by being naive. While they preached diplomacy in the light, they prepared for annihilation in the dark. New Roanoke was not just an agricultural hub, it was a bait colony. Deep beneath the red dirt, past the mining drills and the civilian infrastructure, lay an array of quantum entanglement relays. And that plastic toy spaceship Liam Bennett had been carrying, it wasn't a toy. It was a Class 4 targeting beacon, hardwired to his biometric signature. The moment his vital signs spiked from the trauma of the strike, the beacon activated, transmitting a pinpoint zero-latency coordinate map of the entire planetary sector, including the exact orbital position of Warlord Richter's flagship. At 8-1, inside the heavily fortified bunker of Earth's High Command, General David Hastings stood before a massive tactical display. The video feed of Liam falling to the ground had played exactly once before Hastings turned to his operations officer. "Execute Protocol Jericho," Hastings ordered quietly. "Bring me his head." At 0802, a shadow detached itself from a dark nebula 3 light years from New Roanoke. It was the UNS Vengeance, a stealth frigate equipped with an experimental, highly classified displacement drive. Standard FTL travel required spin-up time, navigation calculations, and an exit trajectory that flared like a sun on enemy sensors. The Vengeance possessed none of these flaws. It didn't travel through space. It folded reality, using the quantum beacon on New Roanoke as an anchor to instantly bridge the gap. Aboard the Vengeance was Task Force Reaper, a 12-man squad of tier, 1 operatives led by Commander Jonathan Cross. Cross was a ghost, a man who had officially died in a training accident 10 years prior. His team wore pitch-black exosuits designed to absorb radar, thermal, and kinetic energy. At 8-4, the Vengeance materialized precisely 70 meters from the portside hull of Warlord Richter's dreadnought, the Oblivion. They were so close that Richter's massive shield arrays were actually behind them. They had jumped inside the defensive perimeter. "Breach," Cross commanded, over the encrypted neural link. At 8-5, 4 magnetic breaching pods fired silently from the Vengeance, latching onto the thick durasteel hull of the Oblivion right outside the Warlord's private command bridge. Shaped plasma charges detonated in perfect synchronization, vaporizing a 3-meter hole in the hull. The vacuum of space violently sucked 2 of Richter's elite guards out into the void before the dreadnought's emergency force fields snapped into place. But it was too late. Task Force Reaper was already inside. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Cross and his men moved with a terrifying, fluid lethality that bordered on the mechanical. They did not shout battle cries. They did not fire warning shots. Magnetic accelerator rifles, suppressed and deadly accurate, fired tungsten slugs at Mach 5. At 8-6, Richter's personal guard detail, 12 of the most feared warriors in the Crimson Pact were dead before their brains could process the atmospheric pressure drop. They fell like heavy timber, their armor pierced flawlessly through the eye visors and neck joints. Warlord Richter, sitting on his elevated command throne, barely had time to stand. He reached for the plasma broadsword at his waist, his alien features twisting from smug arrogance into raw, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to bark an order, to sound an alarm, to demand to know how this was possible. He never got the chance. At 8-7, Jonathan Cross crossed the room in 3 massive strides, augmented by the servos in his exosuit. He grabbed the front of Richter's heavy ceremonial armor with his left hand, yanking the massive warlord forward off his feet. With his right hand, Cross drew a high-frequency monomolecular blade. The blade vibrated at millions of cycles per second, capable of severing atomic bonds. Cross swung once. At 8-8, Warlord Richter's headless body collapsed onto the deck of his own flagship. Cross caught the head by its ceremonial headpiece. He didn't pause to admire his work. He shoved the grisly prize into a vacuum-sealed stasis bag attached to his hip. "Primary target secured," Cross whispered into his comms. "Recall." At 8-9, Task Force Reaper grappled back into their breaching pods. The Vengeance reeled them in, severed its magnetic tethers, and immediately engaged its displacement drive. The frigate vanished from the sector, leaving a crippled dreadnought full of dead guards and a headless empire, completely unaware of what had just transpired. Back on Geneva Prime, the council chamber was still in an uproar. The broadcast from New Roanoke was still playing. The field commander was still laughing at the colonists. It had been barely 9 minutes since the child was struck. Minister Pendleton was screaming at Ambassador Arrington, demanding he authorize an unconditional surrender. "They will kill us all. Arrington, your pride is going to slaughter that entire colony." Thomas Arrington stood perfectly still in the center of the chamber. He didn't look at the screaming politicians. He didn't look at the horrifying broadcast. He simply watched the heavy, ornate oak doors at the back of the council chamber. At exactly 8:10, a localized teleportation flash, a technology heavily restricted on Geneva Prime, illuminated the rear of the hall. The blinding blue light forced the delegates to shield their eyes. When the light faded, a single human stood in the doorway. It was a courier, wearing the dark, unmarked uniform of Earth's naval intelligence. In his right hand, he held a heavy, black, vacuum-sealed bag. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The courier walked down the central aisle, his boots clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. He bypassed the screaming delegates, bypassed Minister Pendleton, and stopped directly in front of the central podium. Without a word, the courier unzipped the bag, grabbed its contents, and hurled it onto the pristine white marble desk of the High Council. The heavy, severed head of Warlord Richter rolled across the desk, leaving a thick smear of dark purple blood. Its eyes were frozen in wide, undeniable terror. It came to a stop right next to Minister Pendleton's gavel. Ambassador Arrington finally turned his gaze from his watch. He looked around the silent, paralyzed room, his eyes locking onto the stunned alien delegates who had previously mocked human fragility. "The human race," Arrington said, his voice echoing in the absolute silence, "does not negotiate with child abusers. This session is adjourned." The absolute silence in the grand chamber of Geneva Prime was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the metallic scent of copper. The severed head of Warlord Richter rested exactly where it had landed, an undeniable, gruesome testament to a promise kept. The alien delegates, beings who had spent the last decade treating humanity as a naive, fledgling species, fit only for taxation and mockery, were paralyzed. Several of the more amphibious representatives from the inner worlds began to violently purge their stomachs. Minister Arthur Pendleton stared at the blood, staining his pristine white marble desk. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The bureaucratic world he understood, a world of sanctions, treaties, and endless toothless debates, had just been violently overwritten by the cold, unforgiving reality of human warfare. "Arrington," Pendleton finally choked out, his voice trembling so violently he had to grip the edges of his podium to stay standing. What have you done? The Pact. They have billions of soldiers. You've condemned us to total war." Ambassador Thomas Arrington did not blink. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket, his expression completely devoid of remorse or fear. "Minister, you fundamentally misunderstand the situation," Arrington replied, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. We have not started a war. We have bypassed it entirely. Look at the feed. Arrington gestured to the massive holographic projection hovering above the chamber. On the surface of New Roanoke, the situation had shifted with whiplash-inducing speed. Less than 30 seconds after Warlord Richter's head had been separated from his shoulders, the encrypted command network of the Crimson Pact suffered a catastrophic failure. The dreadnought Oblivion, hanging in low orbit, automatically broadcast the Warlord's flatline telemetry to every piece of armor, every ship, and every soldier under his command. In the center of the dusty plaza, the towering Crimson Field Marshal, who had struck Liam Bennett, froze. A shrill digital scream echoed from his helmet's internal comms, signaling the sudden, impossible death of his supreme leader. The Warlords' biometric signal was the keystone of their entire military hierarchy. Without it, their command structure was instantly decapitated. The Field Marshal looked up at the sky, panic overriding his biological conditioning. He turned back to the crowd of cowering humans, raising his plasma rifle to blindly execute the mother and the boy. It was a desperate, fear-driven reaction. He never pulled the trigger. The greatest trick humanity had played on the galaxy was not convincing them that they were weak. It was convincing them that their civilians were defenseless. Sarah Bennett was not just an agricultural technician. Before she settled on the frontier to raise her son, she had spent 10 years as a Tier 1 contractor for Aegis Defense Services, a massive private military corporation that had heavily transitioned into off-world security. Her placement on New Roanoke was not an accident. It was highly classified. The entire settlement was a carefully constructed honey trap, underwritten by a black-budget contract from Palantir Deep Space Analytics, aimed at monitoring the Crimson Pact's border incursions. As the Field Marshal raised his weapon, Sarah's entire demeanor shifted from a terrified mother to a predator. She didn't scream. She moved. With blinding speed, she swept her leg, shattering the Field Marshal's exposed knee joint, a weak point heavily documented in Palantir's tactical databases. As the massive alien collapsed forward with a roar of pain, Sarah vaulted off the red dirt, grabbing the heavy, magnetic sidearm holstered at the Field Marshal's hip. In one fluid, brutal motion, she unholstered the weapon, jammed the barrel beneath the alien's kinetic helmet, and pulled the trigger. A localized plasma charge detonated, vaporizing the Field Marshal's cranium. His massive, armored body slammed into the dust, right beside the plastic toy spaceship. This was the trigger. Across the plaza, the illusion of the helpless colony shattered. The miners and teachers moving among the crowd, all undercover Aegis contractors, drew concealed, 3D printed kinetic sidearms that bypassed the colony's own weapon scanners. Within 10 seconds, the remaining Crimson Pact infantry in the plaza, completely disoriented by the death of their warlord and their field marshal, were subjected to a perfectly coordinated crossfire. Tungsten rounds ripped through the unarmored joints of their suits. The plaza was secured before the alien troops even realized they were under attack. Sarah threw the alien sidearm aside and dropped to her knees, sliding through the dust to reach Liam. Her hands, steady as stone when she had executed the alien commander, now shook violently as she checked her son's pulse. He was unconscious, a horrific bruise swelling across his temple, but he was breathing. "Medic!" Sarah screamed, the facade of the stoic operator cracking to reveal the terrified mother beneath. A man who had previously been posing as the colony's hydroponics director sprinted over. He slid a General Dynamics portable trauma pod off his back, a highly advanced piece of medical hardware usually reserved for elite shock troops. He cracked a localized stasis stimulant and pressed it against Liam's neck, stabilizing his neural pathways and preventing a cranial hemorrhage. "I've got him, Sarah," the medic said quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Vitals are stabilizing. The beacon worked. Hastings kept his promise." Up in orbit, the dreadnought Oblivion was in complete disarray. Without Richter, the ship's bridge devolved into a chaotic power struggle. They didn't even notice the secondary displacement signatures until it was far too late. General David Hastings, sitting in his bunker back on Earth, had not just sent one stealth frigate. That was merely the scalpel. Now he was bringing the hammer. 3 massive slip-space ruptures tore open the space around New Roanoke. From the void emerged the 75th Ranger Regiment, Orbital Division, carried aboard 3 heavy assault carriers bearing the insignia of Lockheed Martin's stellar fleet. They didn't broadcast warnings. They didn't ask for surrender. Swarm missiles, utilizing advanced targeting algorithms developed by DARPA, flooded the vacuum, systematically blinding the Oblivion sensor arrays and neutralizing its weapon batteries in a brilliant, terrifying display of automated destruction. Thousands of human drop pods detached from the carriers, streaking through the purple atmosphere of New Roanoke like a localized meteor shower, sealing the perimeter and trapping the remaining Crimson Pact forces on the planet. The battle was over before the first drop pod even hit the dirt. Back in the council chamber, the holographic feed switched from the violent street-level skirmish to an orbital view of the Crimson Pact dreadnought being systematically dismantled and boarded by human forces. The silence in the room had transitioned from shock to a deep, primal terror. The delegates looked at Ambassador Arrington not as a diplomatic peer, but as a monster wearing a tailored suit. Minister Pendleton finally sank slowly into his chair, his eyes fixed on the head of Warlord Richter. You had this planned," Pendleton whispered. "You used your own people. You used a child as bait." Arrington's eyes hardened, sweeping across the room. "Let me make something abundantly clear to everyone in this room," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low timbre. "Humanity does not sacrifice its children. The Artemis contingency was designed precisely because we knew the Crimson Pact targeted the weak. New Roanoke was heavily fortified by Aegis Defense Services. We knew the risks, and our operatives volunteered. The boy, Liam, was a variable we tried to avoid, but his survival was our primary objective, and because of him, we had the biometric lock we needed to bypass the Oblivion's shields." Arrington stepped away from his desk, walking slowly toward the center of the floor. The alien delegates instinctively shrank back as he approached. "For 10 years, Arrington continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "we have sat in this chamber and played your games. We paid your tariffs. We smiled at your insults. We listened to you debate the human problem as if we were a nuisance to be managed. We let you believe we were soft because peace is profitable. Peace is efficient." He stopped, turning his back to the holographic display and facing the entire assembly. "But you mistook our restraint for weakness. You mistook our diplomacy for cowardice. You allowed Warlord Richter to annex 3 independent systems, and you did nothing. When he moved on human territory, you assumed we would retreat." Arrington pointed a finger directly at the High Minister. "You forgot our history, Pendleton. Humanity spent the last 5,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. We built weapons that can split atoms, viruses that can erase populations, and engines that can fold reality. We didn't stop fighting because we forgot how. We stopped because we realized how terrifying we are." A low murmur of panic rippled through the delegates. An ambassador from the Centaurian Coalition, a tall avian species, stood up, his feathers ruffled in agitation. "This is an act of unprovoked aggression," the Centaurian squawked. "The Interstellar Council will sanction Earth. We will blockade your trade routes. You will do absolutely nothing," Arrington interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive, tossing it onto Pendleton's desk. It clattered against the marble, coming to rest beside the Warlord's severed head. "That drive contains the telemetry data from Operation Damocles," Arrington stated coldly. "While you were busy debating trade regulations, Boeing's Deep Space Division deployed a network of passive, stealth-cloaked kinetic penetrators into high orbit around every single one of your homeworlds, Geneva Prime included. They are roughly the size of a school bus, constructed of dense, radar-absorbent tungsten. If dropped from orbit, they will strike your cities with the kinetic force of a high-yield nuclear weapon, without the messy radiation fallout. The color drained from every face in the room. The Centaurian ambassador slowly sat back down, his beak snapping shut in horror. "We have 20 of them positioned above your capital right now, Minister Pendleton," Arrington said quietly. "They are linked to a dead man's switch on Earth. If the Council attempts to sanction us, if a single military vessel enters the Sol system without our express permission, the gravity tethers will release. Your civilizations will be reduced to craters in approximately 4 minutes. Arrington walked back to his desk and calmly picked up his briefcase. The illusion was gone. The polite, subservient human diplomat had vanished, replaced by the representative of an apex predator that had finally decided to bare its teeth. Warlord Richter thought he could send a message by striking a human child, Arrington said, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the council chamber doors. He succeeded, but the message wasn't for us. It was for you. He looked back one last time, his gaze sweeping over the terrified assembly. The rules of the galaxy have changed today. We are no longer asking for a seat at your table. We own the table. If you wish to trade, we will trade. If you wish to talk, we will talk. But if you ever threaten our people again, if you ever lay a hand on a human child— Arrington let his gaze linger on the severed head bleeding onto the white marble. We will not bother with negotiations. We will simply erase you from the sky. Arrington opened the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the corridor, leaving the Interstellar Council in a deafening, terrified silence. 50 light-years away, in the secure medical ward of the UNS Vengeance, Liam Bennett opened his eyes. The bruising on his face was already fading, thanks to the accelerated healing nanites administered by the General Dynamics trauma team. He looked around the sterile white room, his eyes wide, until he saw his mother sitting by his bed. Sarah smiled, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as she gripped her son's small hand. On the bedside table sat his battered plastic spaceship, heavily cracked but still in one piece. "Mom?" Liam whispered, his voice raspy. Did we win?" Sarah looked at the plastic toy, then up at the reinforced steel bulkheads of the human warship that had torn reality apart just to keep him safe. She thought of the men in the pitch-black suits, the falling dreadnought, and the message that was currently rippling across the stars. "Yes, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing his forehead. "We won, and nobody is ever going to hurt you again." Out in the cold, dark expanse of the Orion Spur, humanity finally stepped out of the shadows. The galaxy had awoken a sleeping giant, and as the Crimson Pact collapsed into ash and memory, a new era began. The era of Earth, and they would never, ever be underestimated again. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, protective heart of humanity, hit the like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another epic sci-fi HFY adventure. What would you do if you were in Ambassador Arrington's shoes? Let us know in the comments right below. See you next time, Commanders.